Yes, I am.
Should we just leave it live?
You can. I mean,
But then
you
I'm
can-
taking your computer all day.
Yes, that's the plan.
Okay, well, I didn't want to take your, I mean,
No, that's the plan.
let's just leave it open then.
Can she say something?
What?
Can you say? Can you tell me about yourself real fast?
I am Kristen.
A little bit longer.
I'm trying to,
Yep, it worked. It's working.
all right.
Okay, so what do I send to my users?
You will see this right here.
Yeah, email that to me.
And they're gonna see because it's not linked to the thing. What? Ah, that's not what I want.
Good morning.
Huh? Yeah, it does. I think so.
Thank you.
I didn't do anything. I'm just here for support.
For moral support, well,
Moral support.
he's been such a gem. It's,
There's a lot, there's a lot of moving parts.
Well, I do need
See you.
Are you good now?
I think I am. Well, I'm never good, but you
I'm
know.
gonna take care of an issue I can't get Jesse to get off the street.
Okay. Thank you very much for your support. Appreciate it.
thank you so much.
Internet.
John know we'll do what we can. Okay.
You're welcome.
Good morning. Good.
Yeah, we all feel that way too. Right, I agree.
How often you guys meet?
Every 2 months.
Oh.
I won't bother you anymore.
No.
Hi, Ramona.
No, I don't mind you guys here at all.
Ramona.
I do not mind you guys at all
You're the best.
All right.
because you keep me employed.
If you have an extra lunch, I'm gonna get it for you.
Oh, thank you. You don't have
I
to.
don't, well, I'm hoping we'll have an extra one. I'll grab one for you
I was
anyway.
thinking
Is there
about
anything
near
you
the
don't like?
stage.
It's food, right?
Yeah.
I'm good.
Okay.
You don't have to.
Tell anyone.
I won't tell anyone.
Sorry, we were harassing you on your days off.
No, that's all right. That's all right.
Sorry.
Y'all.
Actually, you could have signed in here. You're a 360.
I don't have Outlook.
What do you have?
We
Google?
use Google Mail.
Okay. What you can do is you can log in and cut me out, and you can do it directly.
Well, since you're in, just email me.
No, I didn't get in.
Oh,
What you can do is just go to Google Mail and just make this your own. Actually, you are. So go here,
She said your son threw it in the trash.
go to Mail.
Okay. Keep going. Do you need your?
Here you go.
No, I just-
and what do I
And
do?
then new email. Go to here and press the copy, push the plate. Is there a paste there?
Yeah.
Did it go? No. Go back to YouTube. Did we lose it?
We lost it.
No, don't say that. Don't say
Does that
that.
mean you need to move?
I will, but
Don't
I'm
say
gonna
that.
wait until I get to-
Yeah.
I gotta-
See, don't say that. You scared me.
Sorry.
No, it's okay.
Here, you do it.
I think it is not.
Oh, I didn't mean to do that. We can do this though.
Which is, I'm so excited.
Copy.
I'm not even gonna lie.
There might be a piece.
And go back to this.
Oh, there it is.
Go
Inbox.
here. Copy, paste it there.
This is what this last paper.
That's the link.
Oy vey is right.
What are we doing?
The newest thing comes to replace, they get less excited. This is something they were excited about.
All right, let's make sure. Oh, my knees.
I know, right?
After not making any of the changes that we talked about, you know, and they said, we have no idea.
Hasn't come through yet.
Yeah.
Hasn't come through yet.
Hmm?
Hasn't come through yet.
The fine hasn't come through yet.
It's not in my inbox.
Okay. You sent it, right?
Yeah.
Let's go to.
Yeah, that's me, Laura.
This is what you just sent, right?
Yeah.
It's sent. You sent it.
Oh, it's from Kathleen Kinchlow. Why is it from Kathleen? I did get, yes, I got it. But for some reason it has Kathleen's name on it.
Because remember, you used her information to log in. On YouTube.
No,
Huh?
no, it must be still in her name.
No, when we logged into YouTube, YouTube is a Google Suite. When we logged into Google as YouTube, it took the whole browser over, so therefore everything you do is from her.
Got it.
Make sure when you're done, this is done, make sure she changes her password.
Okay, so is it on now? Can we go back to, so I can?
Sure can.
So,
Here. So this is what they see.
Yeah.
It's yours. So we'll do this.
I'm gonna turn the chair this way.
Mm-hmm.
We did it.
Kristen,
Right.
can you just pop up my presentation? I can make sure this works.
oh, I need to put it on,
Did you have
I didn't have
questions
it on
for
the-
John before
no,
he
I didn't.
leaves?
I haven't,
Okay, don't worry about
I'm
it.
putting
Just
it
let
on
me
the flash drive right now.
Okay, let me know when it's ready.
Oh, I'm doing your OFA one right now. Hold on just a second. Yeah, I can pull that up. I wasn't thinking. All right, so. All right, try. Is the thing, maybe it's not plugged into the computer yet?
You plugged it in. Is it plugged into the correct computer?
It's possible. I don't see it.
I think it's in the back here.
Oh, so it's there.
So laser.
And I'll even do recall.
It's on, it's showing the.
Yeah. Actually, we're trying to make it quicker. That way we can use that and they can work on it. And so, because if the public comes out this whole way to serve. I think it's the latter.
Fashionable weather.
So
I have the presentation on my.
I just don't know if you didn't use yours, so I wanted to put it on this just in case.
Okay.
I think it's the bird, the owl. I think they're just trying to get it set up and then they're gonna turn it off for the correct meeting.
Yeah.
I still am not in regular shoes yet. Tiny bit, but it's so much better. Yeah. Sure it's faster getting stuff done. Some days I don't feel anything, which is wonderful. So. Yeah, I want to be very careful of the wires. There we go. No, I have an extra one, so 20. Hold on. Ashley. That's okay.
Three weeks.
How are you today?
I'm good. Don't touch me.
Okay. You been under the weather?
Oh, 3 weeks ago. And it doesn't seem to be getting better.
This is for the sticker?
Yes.
Okay.
I have a test, so it's not good.
How are you? Good. What's that? It's for Ashley. Okay. You working now? Oh, this is a touch screen. I touched it with my hand. I didn't know it was touch screen. Okay, yeah. That was a shock. Thank you.
Excuse me, everyone. Excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt this conversation, but since the tables have been moved, please watch your step when going across the wiring. I do not want anyone to get injured or hurt at all. Thank you. Please be careful.
Thanks, John.
How are you doing, by the way?
Good, how are you?
Is our girl better?
She still tested positive yesterday for the 11th day.
I've had this whole for 3 weeks.
But everybody else in her house is negative now. Everybody else is negative.
Well, we had developers' daughter.
Anyone, one thing that anyone of the council do is say that they provide council's advice. Should. Oh, it's like a rat hair. Happy New Year, Cup.
You have a good trip, Marge? Yeah. I didn't pass you, did I?
I don't know.
See you. Hi, baby.
Somebody pop in and
I do. I have one you can borrow. Do you have a? Alex. So I have a cord and I have it plugged into this, I gave you the whole thing. It's so frustrating. No, it's not a bell. Oh, good. So good. Thank you so much for it.
Yes, thank you so much.
That's just good. And this big one, could have changed since. The owl.
So Zeb, what have you been up to?
Well, actually, four ones have been added in.
Definitely now.
These are, it's just for what
I'm waiting to be told, what's my wife to tell me?
Where's it coming from?
Yeah, it's underneath that, put that up.
You all right? It is the owl.
All right, I'm gonna go ahead and call the meeting to order. We may have a couple of others joining us hopefully over the next couple of minutes. So first of all, let me go say Happy New Year. And we appreciate the hospitality of the folks here at J Stars once again. A little bit of a switch of room, but I think we've got plenty of space here, so appreciate the opportunity. We're gathered kind of, we're separating our meeting into two sections, and this first one is predominantly, we'll do a little bit of this, it's predominantly an education session. We have a commitment to trying to ensure, our personal development around topics of diversity and inclusion and its relationship to higher education. Today, we're going to focus on people with disabilities and really just get grounded. I think, we're in need of, at least a lot of us, kind of a basic set of information before we can really start to contemplate what might be effective policies at better serving that people in our community. Do want to let folks know that we do have a new member, unable to join us today, but that's Jason Altuve. He was the interim CEO for the EDT, and as you probably know, the head of the EDT is an ex officio member of SHEV, and so he will fill that role as part of the EDT. We're also going to be missing John and Victoria for this first session, but we do expect Victoria to be joining us a little bit later, and I think John is going to be able to join us. So first of all, we would like to get approval of the minutes from the October 15th meeting. Does anyone have any additions or deletions or changes? If I could have a motion to approve? Thank you. Second? Thank you. All in favor? Aye. All right, so let me turn it over to Ashley Lockhart and Todd Massa. And they're going to help us learn a bit about the state of things here in Virginia as it relates to students with disabilities.
Yes, good morning. Ashley Lockhart. I am the Academic Affairs Associate for Academic Initiatives. Unfortunately, Todd Massett can't be here today. He had a COVID exposure. So if you have any very detailed data questions, I can try and answer them, but most likely will defer to his expertise. So today I'm here to talk to you about why students with disabilities is an issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And today we're going to talk about the scope of the issue, that there are different experiences between secondary and post-secondary for students with disabilities, and that's based on barriers to access and persistence. But I also want to tell you that it's not hopeless, that we have been working for the last 5 years, particularly on this issue, to improve the experiences of students with disabilities in higher education. And that we're going to talk to you today about how we're going to do some more coming up. And I wanted to begin with the Virginia Plan for Higher Education because our first goal is equitable higher education. And in that, it specifically mentions expanding post-secondary opportunities, specifically for disability support and other services. And so that circles back to why this is so important to the goals that we set out in the Virginia Plan. If you have any credential, your earning power increases by 84% over a lifetime. But as you can see, with labor force and degree completion rates, there's a huge disparity between students, those with disabilities and those without disabilities. This means that a student with disability is already at a significant disadvantage before they even leave K-12 to go on to potentially the workforce or higher education. This is a chart of the current population of students with disabilities in Virginia public schools. I just wanted to draw your attention to the category specific learning disabilities. If you can't read it, there's over 51,000 students. And that category includes perceptual disabilities, brain injury, minimal brain dysfunction, dyslexia, and developmental aphasia. But also, there are 24,000 students with autism, 23,000 students with speech or language impairments. This is a huge number of students with disabilities right now in our K-12 system. Exactly, almost 170,000 students to be exact. That's 13% of the entire K-12 population. And in the 12th grade, there are 14,000 students with disabilities graduating this year, getting ready to enter the post-secondary pipeline. As you can see, that's equivalent to 40% of the total number of first-year students. 14,000 is also larger than some of our universities. It's also largely equivalent to the number of transfers that we get every single year. This is a huge number of students that are entering the pipeline. However, the experience and requirements for students with disabilities is different between secondary and post-secondary education. In secondary education, the burden is on the school and the district to not only identify the disability, but also provide the accommodations through something that's called an individualized education plan or an IEP. However, when a student leaves the K-12 system, the burden is suddenly on them. They are required to provide documentation of their disability, and they are required to request their accommodations and advocate for themselves. And in many cases, that's the first time that a student has ever had to do that, when those accommodations are absolutely necessary for them to achieve success in higher education. Let's talk about some of the barriers. Every year, the Department of Education requires the Virginia Board of Education to do a survey of its students with disabilities 1 year out from high school. The latest survey found that 13% of students with disabilities are considered unengaged, which means that they are neither employed nor are they accessing any kind of education. So just 13% of those students are completely out of the workforce and education systems. So some of those barriers that prevent students from doing that, admissions barriers. In order to take an admissions test, like the SAT or the ECT to get into college, if you have a disability, the onus is on you to document that disability. And those are variegated and can be difficult. And actually a lot of the testing companies have been sued for failing to follow federal law in granting the accommodations necessary. Then the accommodations themselves may not be what a student needs in order to access college. Or if you have certain types of disability, there just may be no accommodation, like if you have a developmental disability. And then there's the financial barrier. It costs a lot of money to get documentation of your disability. The K-12 system does it for you and that's covered. But that IEP doesn't count for documentation when you get to college. You have to go out to a doctor, to a psychologist, psychiatrist, and get new documentation, which can cost upwards of thousands of dollars. And then you have to bring it back to your school, and they have to accept it, which they may not. And each school, even in Virginia, has a different standard and different requirements for what that documentation must be. And then there's the financial. Our students who are already very underserved, under-resourced, are they going to be able to do that? Are they going to be able to spend $1,000 out of pocket to get that, on top of buying books and buying food and paying their rent? But if they do make it to college, did you need me to go back here? But if they do make it to go to college, they're 10% less likely to even graduate. That's if they jump over all of those hurdles to get into college. They only graduate at a 41% rate in 6 years because the onus is on the student. Once the student has their documentation and they go to the academic disabilities office and they request their accommodations, they are A, not guaranteed to get the accommodations, and B, they have every single semester for every single professor, they have to have a meeting with them to express what they need and get the accommodations from those professors, who in turn also may not give them to them. That is a huge, huge burden on the students. And the documentation is another big issue because the schools, like I said, you don't know necessarily if your documentation that you paid thousands of dollars for is even going to get you what you need to succeed. And all of these add up to intangibles, the psychological and emotional burden that puts on students every single semester of every single year before every single class. Specifically, our research shows that there's a big shame. There's a lot of shame involved in identifying yourself as a student with a disability and having to tell your professors, and that there's a worry that the professor may treat you differently then if they know about your disability. But there's really no way to keep it private and get the accommodations that you need. There are also institutional challenges. These schools are playing catch up every day. Swarms of students come in every year and request accommodations, and they can only do so much at a time. And then there's always a midterm crunch and a final crunch. But if you didn't get your accommodation that you needed, and you took your midterms and you didn't do well, you're setting yourself up for an entire semester and then potentially an entire school career that doesn't reflect your ability to do your work and to understand the material. There's also always new technology coming out, which is great, but it's expensive. It's expensive to give students recording pens and special notebooks. It's expensive to have sign language interpreters and to have closed captioning. And this became very, very apparent during COVID as well. It was very difficult for students with disabilities to understand what was happening and to move at their own pace when all of a sudden they had lack of support. And then the colleges and universities are also helping students with this huge transition from where everything was taken care of for them to where they have to take care of themselves and advocate for themselves. So we were the first state to actually even look at this issue. We completed a comprehensive study of students in Virginia in higher education. And we presented this to the Disabilities Commission in 2017. And some of the recommendations included creating an advisory committee that would help institutions and practitioners in the field to come up with ways to make this experience better, specifically with regard to documentation. They also said, we don't even know where these students are. We don't know what colleges they're in. We don't know if they left altogether. We only have that one survey called Indicator 14. If they have an active IEP the year that they graduate from high school. That is the only information that we have 1 year out, and that's only 1 year out. And they also proposed enhanced resources for some disability categories like IDDD, that's intellectual disability, and developmental disabilities, because they typically do not qualify for financial aid because there's a test that you have to take called the ability to benefit in order to qualify for federal financial aid. And many students with these disabilities do not qualify for that. So they can't get aid. But if they do participate in some kind of post-secondary education, their lifetime earnings increase 84%, like the general population. So we created a committee, an advisory committee, which I run. You can see that it's multiple agencies that assist with persons with disabilities, all of the 2-year and 4-year at colleges, State Council of Higher Education. And this is really a peer-to-peer group and an educational group, and one that I have found extremely valuable as we navigate these waters that no other state has done. So part of what I do is bring in national experts to advise our institutions on compliance. We had one on ADA compliance. We had an attorney from the Eastern District of Virginia give a great presentation on ADA compliance in Virginia. And also we had someone from the Disabilities in Higher Education Association, National Association, come in and talk to us about best practices for documentation. But they also identified research priorities, which I keep circling back to this data collection. If we don't know where they are, then we can't help them. So we're going to be the first in the nation again. We're going to try to remove these barriers by first collecting data on the students. So a big shout out to Todd's policy analytics team. They worked with our advisory committee. They created a special work group on data collection because some of the schools do collect data at their own level, but that's only self-identified data. The student has to self-identify, and so they collect. And they collect it on all kinds of different categories that aren't related to the 13 that you saw before. So once we know where these students are and we know how many there are, we can start helping them. We can start providing services for them. But it also has other implications on the K-12 system. How are we preparing them for college? If we have this many students, are they getting the preparation that they need before they even apply? Our college access efforts, are we missing a huge target that we could be receiving? But it also is going to allow us to be more strategic about our policies and our resource allocation. And all of this underscores how access to higher education for students with disabilities is truly an equity issue. Does anybody have any questions?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Am I correct, the student has to disclose when they are admitted to college that they have a disability?
They do not.
They do not have to disclose?
No.
Then how do you collect data from the institutions about how students fare?
When a student, well, so that's what the change would be. They would have to disclose.
They would have to.
Yes, they would have to disclose. And what we've done is we've requested a connection to the VLDS data for K-12 to connect it to our data. And then we will collect information, the same categories, the same 13 categories. And then I talked to Todd yesterday because he couldn't be here, and he said, we're also going to add some additional fields called temporary disabilities because that is an occurrence. And disabled unspecified as well from the institutions.
What triggers the temporary condition?
I would assume it would be some sort of injury, a surgery where they would require an accommodation to be in a wheelchair or have some other kind of access issue.
And one final question, what's the connection between what you do with the boots on the ground, the individuals in each college or university that works to provide accommodations for students with learning disabilities?
Our committee advises them on best practices. So we started with documentation, and we said, this is ridiculous. Why do you require something that you don't? And if someone is walking in with an obvious physical disability, are you really requiring them to go out and get a doctor's note that says that? So that's why we brought in the national experts to give us the ideas about what really should happen. And their advice was to lower the threshold, to not require all of the extensive paperwork from a doctor to show that you have a disability, that potentially if you have your IEP and you have a prescription for ADHD, that's enough information that they need along those lines to really reduce the burden on the student. But
so you are working with the faculty, as I said, the boots on the ground, the people who administer all of these policies and procedures internally.
Yes, and we have them as part of the advisory committee. The practitioners come to our advisory committee. And we, there was a community college disabilities officer who, I don't know where Jill went, but who was one of the most amazing members and really told us about the experience that she has at the community college system, which is where most students with they have the most number of students with disabilities in the community college system. And so they have pretty robust academic accommodations offices. And it was very shocking to hear some of her experiences.
Yeah, a couple of questions. If you all got a fix or an estimate as to the amount of money would be needed in the system to do all the accommodations that are required to accommodate these disabilities? That's my first question. The second one is, and maybe you just answered it, how well, I mean, do the schools have officers or employees who are responsible for this transition of the disabled children from K through 12 to post-secondary, or is that the problem, that there are no organized, consistent ways of doing that?
I think there are some, but the problem is that it's not enough. And the transition, especially for some students, is very, very difficult to college without any other factors involved. If you are poor, if you are a first-generation college student, you have so many other things that you have to worry about before you even walk in the door, that your ADHD, if you're smart and you think, okay, I'm smart, I was able to get through this. Yeah, I have to take some medicine, but I probably don't need time and a half on my exams. But you do need time and a half on your exams because college is a totally different experience. So I think the transition, working with, connecting the data will help us work with K-12 better. And I think that is one of the big implications, is that K-12 can change the way that they prepare these students if they are, if we find that they are ready for college or not ready or whatever And as far as the number goes, I don't have a number for you. I know that federal law requires that if a student requests an accommodation, no matter how expensive it is, the school must cover it. And if they don't, then, they'll be sued. And then they look at the entire worth of the school. They don't look at how much money is in the disabilities office. They look at the entire school and as part of their settlement. So it's big liability.
Alex?
Thank you so much for the presentation, and I'd love to get a copy of the PowerPoint with the latest statistics. The report that you prepared in 2017 was excellent, but this has more recent data, so thank you so much for that. I have a few questions, some of it based on your
Alex, I don't interrupt you. Can you turn your mic on? Yes. I'll make sure we can hear you.
Yeah, thank you. I have a few questions, some of it coming from the report supplementing what you just said. But, so in terms of the costs of the evaluations of students, yes, they run in the thousands of dollars. And as you said, K through 12, that burden is, not the burden, but it's provided, the rudimentary is provided by the school. The threshold of testing is different than it is in higher education. So one question, I guess, to look at is the cost of the testing and who's responsible for that, perhaps leaving out of high school. I'm wondering building on the issue of accommodations, there's some discussion of universal design. So I'm wondering in Virginia, is that something that would also address this accessibility if you have universal design where you're thinking about the variety of ways in which individuals access learning, and to what extent that's progressing in Virginia or not on the table, I have no idea. And then just one more area is this area of training and mainstreaming. So in terms of the admissions process, actually two things. One is sort of mainstreaming into the admissions process discussion of university or college interest in DEI, including disabilities, so that it's not a shamed area. And the flip side of that is the faculty training. Anecdotally, I was just hearing about the school systems in California, where all students are now they, unless they specifically request another pronoun. That's a training issue. And so I'm just wondering, in terms of training in our mindset, when it comes to differentiation, what are we doing in the early training for new incoming faculty? So not all of this is to be asked now, to answer now, but I just wanted to highlight these areas. Finally, Virginia just went through an enormous process of standardizing the application process or the transfer process between the community colleges and universities. Is there an effort to standardize across universities and colleges what kinds of requisites there are for applications, systems, testing, et cetera, for students with disabilities? That's a lot. So a lot of this is to be, basically to flag questions that perhaps we can come back to.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm looking for Jody. Is Jody here?
No.
Jody does she in her course design work, she does talk about universal access. So that is something that is being worked on in a different part of academic affairs, but it's something that we are aware of.
Do you know, so the bulk of those students are in BCCS. Does at least BCCS have common practices across the different schools?
No.
Okay.
Not as far as we could tell
Okay.
from our interactions with them.
So is there any, I appreciate that, in I think our very classic Virginia way, right? We prefer collaboration and kind of organic and voluntary movement towards something, recognizing that sometimes differences do make sense, right? I think that we want to just presume that every variation is wrong. And yet, it does sound like, a little bit more consistency. Is there any potential that the advisory committee could at least establish some maybe quantitative or policy goals? That at least on a collaborative basis, you can kind of move toward and measure against and stuff along those lines. Has there been thought of?
Yes, and we have some, and one of those is documentation standardization.
Okay.
Across the board.
And so is there any opportunity for students to get financial support for those documentation costs at this point?
Not as far as I'm aware, unless the institution has psychiatrists or psychologists that are covered by, or that are employed by the university and covered. They would do the work, but anecdotally, they're impossible to get into. There's not enough. And when you have 14,000 students coming into the system.
Yeah. Well, exactly. I mean, I would imagine that access to those practitioners is another barrier, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not just the financial side of it, but the wait list of 30, 60 days are certainly not uncommon with a lot of these things.
Yes, and a lot of the disabilities are psychological.
Yeah.
And so getting into a psychiatrist is impossible for anybody right now. But also one of the biggest categories that's been growing is chronic illness. Students with chronic illnesses like cancer or other long-term chronic illnesses, diabetes, those populations are growing. And they require different kinds of accommodations, days off or other medical accommodations. So it's not only extra test time, it's the gamut of all different kinds of accommodations. And in the end, it comes down to the student advocating for themselves and the professor agreeing to the accommodation.
And then my last question, but what is the process at the K-12 level, and particularly 12, to kind of help students understand this big shift between, the schools taking responsibility for those aspects of their education, and now they have to. I mean, does somebody generally lay it out,
I don't know enough about that process.
Yeah, and I think it's handled on a case-by-case basis, and really, it's based on the school division and the design that's set up within a particular school division. And so my experience in one school division was one way in terms of a handoff, and yet in another school division, it was not similar, somewhat different. And so it's, I would say, probably the best way to describe it is fragmented. We try to do a very good handoff, but it's based on the locality as to how to do that. And in some school divisions, you have a person designated to work with post-secondary to do that handoff.
But a lot of it's related to how many resources your parents have. If your parents can afford to get you all the specialists outside of the school to help you navigate all of those pieces while they're still in high school, they also have the resources to help you above and beyond in college. And so there is within students with disabilities, there's another kind of equity gap.
Sure.
So they call it a double whammy for poor students with disabilities. They're doubly disadvantaged.
Yes, Jeff?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. If I could just add a couple of things to some of the points that Ashley was making on the issue of uniformity across institutions. So one thing about that is that is a higher ed issue. I mean, Virginia is just like the rest of the higher ed landscape. There is not uniformity in how higher ed institutions address accommodating students with disabilities. And a lot of it does have to do with the regulatory difference in the relationship with the federal government in higher ed as opposed to K-12. There are not strict regulations saying what institutions have to do. they have a theoretical burden to not allow barriers to persist. But there's no specific regulatory prescription about how to do that. And if a student feels that they're not being accommodated properly, the burden is on them to file complaints, file lawsuits, et cetera. Very different environment from K-12. Another thing I wanted to point out is that there is variability, not just across institutions, but within institutions. So when we first started having these conversations with disabilities officers, we had one institution, we had 2 different disability services officers from the same institution. One was from the main part of the campus that dealt with the broad office of undergraduates, and the other one was from a specialized, very well-funded school within the university. In that school, they have no barriers. Anyone who comes in and says, I think I have a disability, they pay for state-of-the-art evaluations, and they do accommodations with no questions. The other office on the main campus has no resources. So every student who comes in there has to be bringing a diagnosis that will justify the accommodation. That was within one university. Now, I think, one thing I don't recall because I've had to step back a little bit is exactly how much the advisory committee's work on developing guidance about documentation may really have helped some of that variability. But anyway, I wanted to point out that A, it's a broad higher ed issue. B, the variability can occur at all different levels.
That didn't make me feel any better.
No, well, I wasn't trying to make you feel better, maybe just a little bit better informed.
I have a question because I think it is very important information. So what's the ability of the advisory committee through Chev to communicate some of this information in a easy to understand version to the policymakers, to the General Assembly, to the Behavioral Health Commission, to the, it just seems to me that we're losing, if we're not doing that, we are losing an opportunity to get some information in front of people who could make a difference.
I think there are a couple of opportunities. One is that the committee comes up with, extensive guidelines about documentation, which we have the beginnings of. And Joe presents it to IPAC. And through IPAC, it's disseminated into the institutions that this is now how you do documentation. But I don't know if that's.
I'm thinking a little broader than that in terms of, we have our wonderful brochure with information about higher education. Why couldn't we do a similar communications tool for these issues? And just, it seems to me that's a shared responsibility that we should grab and execute.
If I might say, Ms. Webb I think is exactly right. And I think the way you put it, Katie, was you said that there's a missed opportunity. I think there has been something of a missed opportunity. I think we can do more. One of the reasons we haven't done more in this domain is that we don't have a lot of impetus behind the advisory. The advisory committee was very much a staff created thing. It wasn't created by any new legislation, any new policy dictate. We did it within Chev, the people who were interested in staff for these issues, because we saw that there was a gap out there. So it could be, but we could definitely do more with communication. And I would request that council consider how strong a policy push it would like in this area. That would give us some more impetus, and frankly, it would clarify things for us, but how much and what kinds of efforts to put into this area. But there are numerous opportunities to be realized.
Yeah, I think, thank you both. I'm glad you added some clarity to this, Joe, because you're right, there is wide variation, not just across institutions, but within. That was my point about, the boots on the ground. I think the council can be helpful in being more explicit about where we stand with regard to this as a policy issue. I think it begins at the top. This is an issue not just K through 12 and, you know, college, but law schools, medical schools have been dealing with this for years. And I think that if we can provide some explicit support and policy guidance at the very highest levels of institutional leadership, I think it'll help a whole lot. Because some people just kind of look the other way. It's a long-standing issue. I can recall when AD was first approved, enacted by the Congress. And there are still some institutions I know are lagging, not just, you know, I mean, it's even worse at K through 12. Talk to some parents and, you know, it's totally frustrating.
Okay, yes.
Thank you, council members, for this contribution to this conversation. Ashley, do you have another scheduled meeting of the advisory committee?
I don't right now, but in this first quarter.
Okay, so when you do, you have a lot of really good information. that we
Yes.
received today.
Yes, thank you so much. And I know it will mean a lot to them that council is interested in the issue.
We'll have some follow-up conversations and, you know, I think try to get some additional input from, you know, presidents and other vested parties here as we think about how to more assertively move forward on policy. But, thank you. It is, you know, it's tricky, as you said, there's big data gaps. And I'm sure that, you know, causes folks to pause, and I'm sure we will all want more. And yet I also feel sure that there are at least a couple of areas where we've got enough clarity that we should be able to educate these steps. Excellent. Thank you very much. Very good presentation. All right, we are going to take a break and move to our council meetings. So we've got academic affairs will be moving to 117. Resources will stay here. We do have something a little bit different happening for lunch that is noted on the agenda, which is we are going to get a chance to meet the Secretary of Education designee, Amy Rockstead Figueroa. And so I would ask that folks kind of gather food and kind of get settled back in by, let's say, about 12:15. As you can imagine, she's on a pretty tight schedule, so I think we've got a very short window, but we really, you know, wanted to take advantage of the opportunity to meet her next year.
I'll amend what you just said a
Okay.
little bit. She's going to try to get here between 11:30 and 11:45.
Oh,
And
okay.
I know the committee meetings may still be in session, so aim to have your lunch ready around noon.
Got it, okay.
And we can have a chance to have a conversation with her.
All right, we're adjourned. Thank you. Yes.
I have it right here. And how do you use the
We're still here.
December of 1968. 6 months ago.
Great.
Okay.
I it was early morning.
Yeah, I mean,
Torn one.
yeah.
But not way short, I keep it.
Good to see you. Good to see you.
Yeah. I might work.
I got this, I fell.
I trust you.
We'll guard it.
Thank you.
And,
Trying to avoid surgery. Yeah, the longer you go, the older you get, the harder it is to recover.
Yeah.
Yeah.
that's not good.
And I'm trying to, you have back surgery?
Yeah.
You don't have just one.
That's
And
it.
I don't want to start that. So I'm gonna do this around here as well.
Yeah, I'm fine once I get better, but boy, it's different stuff. But I'm on an airplane. Okay.
Oh, yeah, no, I think it's fine.
I've been known to go without hosting for
I'm just going today.
Overserved? No, it's just my appendages.
Hey, Wendy.
How are you?
Hi, good to see you as well.
You want some help, Wendy?
So I guess we gotta get, together about.
I have the, I have a calendar of activities that I keep, and I have it based on what you said in the meeting last week. I have the first one going out Monday, the 24th. And that's usually all been filed. I just put it on that day, because you said they would be filed by Friday.
Yeah.
So if I can get that, on Friday, I can get it out either that Monday or Tuesday. I'm gonna put out early.
Yeah, I gotta get that to the, I can't remember the name of this, access. I gotta figure out the database that I was using.
Oh, yeah,
I retrained myself to do that.
every year, right?
Every year, I gotta figure it out all over. It's easier. It's like, oh yeah, I remember.
We've been talking about this for a while.
Just the one.
It must, because I was doing it last year. And we were all remote. All right, I'll put that on my calendar as a
Okay.
reminder.
But who maintains the house?
Yeah.
I'm gonna put you on speaker. Okay, yes, there's a lot of background.
Yeah, this is easy to hear. No, this is, this, yeah, this is.
So Beverly, I have a book. I have them scheduled for January 24th, February 17th.
Uh-huh.
And where's the third one? It's missing. Oh, on March 14th.
Okay. That makes sense.
But, you know, I mean, obviously we can change those.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, where you sitting? I'll give you the yellow. Say, where you sitting? I'll give you the yellow. Okay.
Right here.
I hear. Anyway, I'll take the yellow. Yeah.
Yeah. So Jenny's.
Prefer we have John on the phone.
Oh, good. Okay. Hi, how are you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the board.
Just gonna move.
Which one? I can send her the PDF. Is she not getting the computer?
Do you have like a flash?
Ashley took my flash drive, but she's got it in the other room, so.
Okay, so it might be on that.
Okay, it's not on that flash drive, but I can put it on that flash drive.
Okay.
Mr. Bay.
Whoever it is.
I'm sure he's not far.
Join the program.
Yeah.
I think John is on, right? John is on.
Yeah, just want them to finish their meeting.
Like I said, we can go.
Okay.
Things very clear.
There you go.
Join us.
And also like, lay on the edge.
Kristen,
Yes.
how did, or will he be able to hear us, or do I need to do something?
You're probably gonna need to hit your mic to say the, yep, the red light.
Red light.
Yep, I can hear it.
How are you? Good to see you.
Wendy?
I think we're galloping into place here. All right. We have-
We,
Ooh.
oh, we got moved back.
We do, but it's not always there.
Okay, we're calling to order approval of the minutes. Does anyone have any edits, changes, comments to the minutes from our October 25th meeting? If not, do we take a motion or say that?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay. Moving on to discussion of the governor's introduced budget in the General Assembly session. Wendy has an overview of the governor's introduced budget for us.
Well, good morning, committee members. We gave you a little bit of a background going into the end of the year when the governor's budget was released back in December, and provided a short summary. This is a more detailed summary. I'll walk through some of the highlights and then maybe take some opportunity to get some input from you all in terms of where we're at with the budget and where we think things may be going based on the current state. So, first major highlight for this budget is unprecedented. It's a term we keep using, and I guess it could be used again here. As you recall, our budget recommendations were at about 700 million. This governor's budget comes in from what we can calculate at about 925 million. It's the highest increase that we have seen. As we noted here in the initial agenda item, our calculations is it's increasing the operating budget by about 33% and the financial aid budget by 74%, which is significant from what we've seen in the past. A few things that we wanted to highlight. One is we were very pleased with how well these aligned with the governor's, with the SHEV recommendations and what the governor put in. There were very quite a few things that completely aligned that we hadn't really seen in the past. So a few items I'll note, and then I'll walk through several sections in a minute. One is on the financial aid side, nearly all of the SHEV budget recommendations were taken into consideration. That's the undergraduate aid, which is our highest recommendation that we have provided, particularly on the second year with 130 million. The graduate aid was also approved. The tag was also approved and was increased in the second year. We had approved it at 4,600. It went to 5,000 in the second year. In addition, we saw some other investments by the governor in the financial aid area where they added money for expanding the college
Virginia College Access Network at the 2 public HBCUs. This was introduced last year, and the program runs for individuals in a 25-mile radius to get free college at the 2 HBCUs that we have. They expanded that network to go to a 40-mile radius. In addition, the private HBCUs, Hampton and Virginia Union, they also introduced a similar program there.
I just asked a question about that, because we
Yeah.
have, asserted before that the state couldn't do that, right? And so without specific legislation that would maybe enable the public money to be used in that way. So why do we not think that now? Or
Well, this is still, there's a couple of restrictions on the Constitution. It's a good question. A couple of restrictions on the Constitution in terms of how we give money to private institutions. In this case, this is all financial aid. And so by it going as financial aid, and it going to students, and that's allowable. So it's almost, you could consider it a tag plus.
Okay, but it's going to the institutions though, right?
It's
First, and then they allocate it to students.
Well, it's been left a little vague, and Chev is responsible for that, so we'll be doing it and in compliance with how that would be done. And Lee Andes is here to probably be able to state how we stay within our constitutional requirements. And Lee, you might want to come a little closer, because we do have
Congressman O'Connell.
Okay.
President Broderick on the line.
Yes, you talk about how to get funds to the private colleges. The Constitution does allow grants or loans to students. But the way we fund it, I was giving equivalency with TAG. We don't send a check in a student's name to a college. We send the college $1.5 million because they told us they have X number of students eligible to receive funding. So as long as those funds we give them, and they are just a pass-through, they go straight to a student account, we are funding students. The institution is just a pass-through to do that. So when we get into constitutional issues, if we give it to an institution, and then they use it for their own purposes, not necessarily for a student award. So as long as it's a student award, I think we're in good shape as far as Constitution.
And we're not responsible for any true-up or any sort of reconciliation of that. So if they end up with a different number of students versus the pool, are we responsible for somehow?
We would do that. We do that every year for TAG. They tell us they have X number of students. We come back in 2 or 3 times during the year, and again during the fall, 6 months later. How many did you really have? They give us files on that, and if they don't match, then they have to return some funds.
Yeah, there's an extensive kind of audit review process that we do. So Lee actually has, I think it's safe to say, a full staff member to deal with a lot of our aid application programs where we're trying to keep track to make sure that there's students tied to all the $8. That's the primary investments in the financial aid area. I was talking about alignment with the Chev recommendations in the operations. We had recommended to keep, there was $40 million added last year. It was only allowed as one time. We recommend to keep that, allow that to roll into the base. The governor did that, and then as they stated it, they doubled it. So there's some question whether you say it was already there and it got doubled from there, or they added an extra 57 million, which would be, they gave about 97 million in operations to the institutions. If you include the 40 million, they say they more than doubled it. Otherwise, it's about 57 million. There was some rounding with the HBCUs in that area. In addition, this was a first we hadn't seen in a while. We have always recommended operations and maintenance for new buildings coming online. And DPP and the governor did include that in their recommendations. So we were pleased to see that. In addition, we saw various initiatives that were supported at institutions as well. Increased investment in the G3 program. Now, this investment is not on last session, and the session prior was investments on the aid side to get to that. I'll use the term loosely, the free component, the G3 piece of it, where students were getting the reimbursement for tuition fees. This investment is on the institutional side to focus on meeting high demand programs, growing new programs if needed, being able to build up those programs to offer those. So it is not on the aid side, but now more institutional investment.
I thought when we looked at this, they had only used about half of the previous allocation, so.
Yeah, so, and I think they indicated, and Todd Mass's not here, they had indicated that they are starting to get up to full enrollments. Now, again, that was on that's where the students is getting the aid piece, so there's two parts of it. It's what you need to have program capacity and then the aid pieces. We'll have to get back and find out where it is in terms of current day amounts, and I don't know. Tom, do you have that?
Yeah, I think, Chairman Connolly, the half amount of G3 funds that already been spent with the community colleges really just accounted for the first semester, so for that fall
Okay,
semester.
so it made sense. Okay.
So that was one of the big investments in terms of a larger chunk of money. There's also individual institution investments that were made based on institution requests that were submitted. In the area of salary increases, a significant salary increase, if you recall, July 1, we had a 5% salary increase this fiscal year. The governor and general assembly are proposing 5%, or governors are proposing 5% this year and next year. We have not seen that in a while of a potential of 3 consecutive years of 5% increases. I will note that there's a difference in how we made recommendations in the fall, which were on a 3%, versus what the governor is doing on 5%. And this can impact tuition and fees, so we do want to note it as something that's on our radar. The 3%, we really wanted an investment in talent and to give broad flexibility. We made some adjustments, but for the most part tried to